All right, y'all, welcome to the show. Today we have roughly 412 topics. Excited to get into all of them. So later on, we're going to be discussing Donald Trump coming out and saying he wants to ban socialists and communists from the country. Is that legal? No. Is that constitutional? Not even a little bit. Nonetheless, he proceeds. So we'll talk about that. We also have Kirsten Sinema takes a whole bunch of money from a corrupt special interest and then does their bidding. Shock, shock. And I'm going to lead here in just a second with what's going on with the Supreme Court. Suffice to say, they've just lost all of their legitimacy. It is wild, these new numbers that I'll share with you. And also we have on CNN, they are now pawning off the criticism of Dianne Feinstein, whose brain is currently not working. They're pawning it off to sexism. So if you're against somebody who doesn't know where they are serving as a senator, it's because you're simply a misogynist. So we'll talk about all that and much more. By the way, you guys know the deal. Shameless plugs. Everybody click like, click subscribe. Make sure you click that bell icon so you get a notification every single time a video drops. That helps us subvert the algorithm, which is not too kind to political content, to say the least. And remember, you can always listen to the full show over on Spotify if you want to listen to the full audio version of the podcast. And much love and appreciation to everybody who keeps this show going by donating on Patreon. Link in the video description box below, or tipping on YouTube. There's a thanks button below. You can do that as well. Or supporting Crystal, Kyle, and Friends on Substack. Now, by the way, highly recommend you check out this week's Crystal, Kyle, and Friends, because we are going to be debating a libertarian presidential candidate, which is going to be a tremendous amount of fun. So we'll dive into, we'll get to that in the future. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump into the show for today. So guys, take a look at this. This is really something. The Supreme Court approval rating dropped to an all-time low. All time. Let me repeat that. All-time low. So how bad is it, you ask? Well, that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to tell you. 29% approval rating in a Quinnipiac poll. 29%. We are talking about Dick Cheney at the end of Bush and Cheney's time in office. That's how low we're talking about. We're talking about George W. Bush at the end of his time in office. We're talking about lower than Donald Trump immediately after January 6th. We're talking about right at Donald Trump's level after the Republicans got draxed in the midterms and his hand-picked candidates lost the worst. That's what we're talking about here. Now, for those of you who don't know, as a general rule, the way this works is the Supreme Court, with their, their lofty perception of themselves and all the seriousness and tradition and decorum that goes around it, as a general rule, they have a much higher approval rating than the president, than Congress, than, other, pillars of society, you could say. If you poll about different businesses or industries, lines of work, etc., usually they poll pretty well. Now that is all gone. Every last bit of it. So look, it gets into an interesting question, which is number one, why? And number two, what do we do about it? Well, why is very simple. Everybody now sees nakedly what the court is. It's a political body. They like to pretend like they're above politics and they're special and they're just being objective and calling balls and strikes. That is not the way it works. The judicial branch is deeply, deeply political. Now, right-wing judges always accuse left-wing judges of being, activist judges. But in reality, right-wing judges are activist judges too, because everything is political by its very nature. So we've seen Roe versus Wade being overturned with the Dobbs decision. That was, the beginning of the end. That was the beginning of the downfall, where it was like, Roe versus Wade is super duper popular. It's a moderate decision, and they're just throwing it out completely. And we also saw recently the New York case where Andrew Cuomo's top aides were convicted for being corrupt goons who were taking bribes and handing out political favors. And the Supreme Court saw that and said, nah, we disagree. We're actually pro-corruption. So we're going to go ahead and say they're free to go. So look, when you make decision after decision after decision that's extremely questionable, super right-wing, super political, it turns out you can only do that for so long before people realize what's happening. And remember, guys, we heard that the Chief Justice of the court when they were debating overturning Roe versus Wade. I don't know how many of you guys remember this, but the Chief Justice was apparently arguing vociferously behind the scenes to the other very conservative justices. And the argument was, hey man, don't do this. You can't fully throw out Roe versus Wade. It's one thing if you want to tighten the standards, right? This is what he was arguing for. Roe versus Wade set it up so there's 3 trimesters. In the first trimester, it's a right to get an abortion. Second trimester, you could have some health regulations. Third trimester, if states so choose, they could ban it. Then they tightened that up with a case later on where they didn't go by the trimester standard anymore. They tweaked it to fetal viability, which makes the standards just a little bit tighter. But what the Chief Justice was arguing for was like, hey, let's keep the right to an abortion, but let's just, limit that window even more. Let's make it so basically only early term is a right, and then after that, anything after whatever line he's arguing for, I don't know, 12 weeks, 15 weeks, whatever, everything after that, okay, states can ban it. And they looked at him and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to fully get rid of the right to an abortion so that now in red states, if they so choose, they can ban it from the moment of conception. They can ban the abortion pill. They can ban the morning after pill. They can argue for the rights of zygotes and gametes and pre-gestation fetuses and all this stuff. And when they did that, there was a massive backlash. So now what you're seeing is I think they're desperately trying to get a little bit of their legitimacy back. This is what you saw recently with the decision on voting rights, where basically they were like, yeah, you are gerrymandering in a way that's racially discriminatory, so you can't do that. We're going to go ahead and have to fix that. But ultimately, I think the cat's out of the bag. I think it's gone too far. And the question is then, if everybody acknowledges this is a political body and really they're judicial tyrants, right? This is judicial supremacy. They get to override other branches of government and basically legislate from the bench and do their own laws. Well, if that's the case, what do you do about it? Well, the answer is very simple. We have a clear case of what to do from history. Did you know Abraham Lincoln simply ignored the court when he wanted to? Did you know that? Here's a quote. This is in a great article in Jacobin about this exact issue, how Abraham Lincoln fought the Supreme Court. So here's a quote from Lincoln. They say, across the late 1850s, Lincoln argued that the American people, not the Supreme Court, were the true arbiters of the Constitution, and that the only way to defeat the pro-slavery judiciary, after the Dred Scott decision, by the way, was through mass political struggle. And after Lincoln and Hamlin were elected in 1860, the new president's inaugural address articulated this view, perhaps in the strongest language he ever used. Quote, if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having, to that extent, practically resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. They go on here and say, once in power, Lincoln and congressional Republicans reorganized the federal judiciary and packed the court, adding an additional justice in 1863. More fundamentally, though, they simply ignored the pro-slavery precedents established in the 1850s. In June 1862, for instance, Congress passed and Lincoln signed a bill banning slavery from the federal territories, a direct violation of the majority ruling in Dred Scott. The court meekly acquiesced, recognizing that its political power was long since broken. And then they go on to say, legal historian Charles Warren later lamented, Republicans' popular assault on the court crippled the institution for more than a decade. In other words, it's, hey man, you want to enforce that? Why don't you go ahead and do it with your army? Oh, that's right. You don't have an army. Well, I guess you're going to have to go ahead and acquiesce to me then, aren't you? And people will huff and they'll puff and they'll moan and they'll say it's authoritarian and they'll say you're overreaching. But the fact of the matter is, the real authoritarians, the real people who are overreaching, are the judicial supremacists, are the judicial tyrants. When you have a Supreme Court decision, and you have a number of Supreme Court decisions that basically say corruption's fine. In fact, we're going to say that corruption is not corruption. Remember when they said that back in the Citizens United case? They're like, not only is this not corruption, this isn't even the appearance of corruption for politicians to take tremendous amounts of money from corporations and billionaires and then do their bidding. How am I supposed to take you seriously if that's your decision in a case? How am I supposed to take you? I'm not going to take you seriously. That's absurd. When you casually, we haven't seen in a long time, like, it's one thing to not have advancement when it comes to rights. It's a totally other ballgame to start taking away rights that already exist. And that's what we saw with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And that's, again, one of the many reasons why we saw Democrats do way better in the midterms than anybody thought, because there was a backlash to that effect. And so, all these Supreme Court pro-corruption decisions, super conservative when it comes to social issues and rights, there's going to have to be a backlash. And in the numbers, we're already seeing that backlash. 29% approval rating for the Supreme Court. So it doesn't matter how much you put lipstick on the pig, doesn't matter how you dress it up, doesn't matter that they're wearing robes and they pretend to be serious people and they pretend to be holier than thou and they're the Supreme Court and, they pretend like we're objective, we're just calling balls and strikes and, interpreting the law, the plain face reading of it. Doesn't matter how much you say it. People know it's BS. People know it's not true. And now I hope there's going to be consequences that follow. I do want them to pack the court. I do want them to do term limits. And keep it real, I want them to ignore it when they need to ignore it. I do. In a world that made sense, we'd have judicial review, but the justices being reasonable. But they're not that. So what am I supposed to do? And final point here, you guys know this, we've brought this up recently, but it was Tom Hartman who introduced me to this concept. I didn't know. We had a provision in the Constitution that very clearly lays out the ability for Congress to do what's called court stripping or judicial stripping. It's not as dirty as it sounds. What it means is you can pass a law and say, this is not subject to judicial review, so the courts can't overturn this. So in other words, it's, the will of the people as spoken by the body of the people, the legislative body, this is actually the final say on this. When you have a court that's as extremist as this court has been, then what other option are you leaving people? And don't say it's un-American, don't say it's authoritarian, unless you're willing to call Abraham Lincoln un-American and authoritarian. The real authoritarians are the judicial supremacists and the judicial tyrants. And we've put up with it for far, far too long, and it's time to bring it to an end. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.